So, for the next year, the Disney company is celebrating its 100-year anniversary, the 100 Years of Wonder. This is the anniversary of Walt starting a studio in California in October 1923 to make animated films in California. But the celebration officially covers everything that the company created between 1923 and 2023. And admittedly, most of that time was after Walt's passing. Walt was only there for 43 of those 100 years, but still, he was the person whose vision, personality, and determination defined the identity of the company both during his lifetime and in the decades that followed. And as a personal preference, I do wish that there was a little bit more Walt in some of the celebrations that are happening in the parks and in other areas of the company. For a while now, I've been wondering how much of Walt's story could he tell in his own voice if we looked at all of the publicly available sources, such as public presentations, radio interviews, TV interviews, promotional films, and so on. And it turns out that Walt can tell a lot of his story. He does loop back to the same stories more than once, so in many places I have choices as to which audio clip to include. There's this one.
Well, look, I was born in Chicago, and I went to high school in Chicago.
And then there's this.
That's what I am. I'm a mudsucker. I was born in Chicago.
I'm not even sure what a mudsucker is in this context, and I have looked, so if you know, drop me a note. But man, there's a lot more personality in that quote than in the first one. And in listening to all of these clips, it has become clear to me how Walt wanted to present himself at different points in his life, and also how his personality and his comfort level with the public changed from the 1930s through the 1960s. I've spent the last few weeks going through every public interview or presentation with Walt that I could find. So if you've ever wondered, what would Walt tell you about his life? What would he focus on? How would he phrase it? And what might he leave out? Today on the podcast, we're going to try to put a little more Walt back into the Disney 100 Years of Wonder. So, if you're ready, let's go. Though Walt was born in Chicago and later spent a little time there as a teenager, it was Missouri that was his home. In 1906, his family moved to Marceline, where they lived on a farm. This was where Walt first developed an interest in drawing. It's also where he saw the type of small-town life that he later represented in Main Street, USA. And for our story today, which covers Walt's early experiences in film and animation, it's where he grew close to his brother Roy. Walt had 3 brothers, but 2 of them were significantly older. Herbert was 13 years older, and Ray was 11 years older. But Roy was only 7.5 years older. It was Roy that looked after Walt while the family was in that quiet farm and railroad town of Marceline. And here in this clip, in his tone, you can sense Walt's great affection for these years, that time he spent in a little town with little responsibility.
Always wonderful to have a hometown. I feel sorry for people who live in cities all their lives and they don't have a little hometown. I do. The town of Marceline has cropped up many times in things we've done. I mean, the fun we had on the farm, I remember I was just young enough that I didn't have to do any heavy work. Roy had to do all the work, such as milking the cows and things like that. I used to tag along at his heels. And there's many things we did here that I'll never forget. Roy was always my big brother, and he always took care of me. He always saw that if anything come to town, that I had a dime or a nickel to go and spend it. And I remember one time he washed the hearse down here. He said, "Walt, we've got a job washing the hearse." So we went down to wash the hearse. Well, he did the work, and I played dead inside the hearse all day.
In 1910, the family sold the farm. They moved south to Kansas City, Missouri, where Walt delivered papers on a newspaper route overseen by his father. Also in Kansas City, Walt was introduced to movies and stage shows, both of which captured his interest. Walt would briefly move back to Chicago. He would spend a little time in France as part of the American Ambulance Corps in the months following the First World War, but it would be back in Kansas City, where, without his parents, he first created films. While working at the Kansas City Film Ad Company, he learned how to create basic animation. Using paper cutouts with joints at the elbows and knees, he laid these little figures out on a table beneath a downward-facing camera and shifted the cutouts a little between each frame. These weren't cartoons, but they were animated advertisements arranged for local businesses and were shown in local theaters. The circulation for these ads was extremely small, perhaps a few theaters and maybe just one. In this, though, Walt had a great deal of leeway to think of gags and even to create slogans, which would appear on title cards between the action. He was writer, animator, and cameraman.
I started actually in to make my first animated cartoons, 1920. Of course, they're very crude things then, and I used sort of little puppet things. We didn't draw them like we do today. I used to make little cutout things, and joints were pinned, and we'd put them under the camera, and we'd maneuver them and make them do things. And
this was before you came to Hollywood, actually.
Oh yes, this started back in Kansas City, Missouri, where I was working in we made the little advertisements for theaters. It's equivalent to what you see in TV commercials today, you know? Uh-huh. Put your winter coal in early, you know? Get your fedora block for the winter and all those kinds of things. This was back in the days when they had the old canvas tops on cars. Get your top renewed.
That's still necessary, of course.
Yeah. And there was one little thing I did there. You had to think up little gags, little catch things, you know. So I had this spanking, shining car drive in. I had a character on the street. He hailed the driver, and he says, "Hi, old top, new car?" And the guy in the car says, "No, old car, new top." Then we go into the pitch of where to get them renewed and all that stuff.
Throughout his life, Walt talked about his struggles and failures. He did so rather famously with an interviewer crafting a biography about him in the mid-1950s. But for public interviews, those that were broadcast or televised, he tended to contextualize his struggle as part of a life story that led to success. His experience in Kansas City, aside from learning to animate, was not one of the stories that he chose to touch on when talking about his youth in live interviews. The story in Kansas City simply didn't end well, and perhaps by the time he was famous, he was simply more content discussing humorous or happier moments of his early days. But this story is central to understanding Walt. In the months after learning the basics of cutout animation, how individual frames with movement in between could be strung together to create believable continuous movement, Walt was fascinated with animation, not just for ads to be played in Midwest theaters, but the type of 5- and 6-minute cartoons that were being produced in New York. He read about the process of hand-drawn animation and taught himself how to animate. For a while, his parents returned to Kansas City. In a garage that his father built initially as a rental, Walt set up a small studio where he spent his evenings. With a camera that he borrowed from the film ad company, he experimented with short pieces of animation. Animation as an art form combined 3 areas that fascinated him: drawing, technology, and comic entertainment. Initially, he produced short topical pictures, political cartoons arranged with movement that criticized the poor conditions of local roads, the tardiness of streetcars, and the manner in which the Kansas City Police Department managed crime. These were shown at a local theater, which briefly gave Walt a little notoriety. But then he wanted to create something larger. To do this, he incorporated a small business called Laugh-O-Gram Films, which was intent on creating short motion pictures, ideally that would be picked up by a New York distributor. Walt was young, ambitious, and persuasive. Investors included Walt himself, local business owners, a local doctor, and Roy, who was living in warm California while he recovered from tuberculosis. Though Walt himself was just 20 years old, he hired artists slightly younger than him, promising them experience and eventually a salary. Among them were Hugh Harman and Rudy Ising. A couple of his friends, most notably of iWorks, also worked on these productions. Primarily, films produced by Walt would be a series of 6-minute cartoons similar in design to those that were produced in New York by professional artists. Walt created the scripts for sardonic fairy tales filled with modern humor. Cinderella, for example, was a young wash girl who was turned by her fairy godmother into a jazz-age flapper, complete with a stylish touring car instead of a pumpkin for a coach. But Walt also produced live action, most notably a short on oral hygiene for a local dentist, which extolled the importance of regularly brushing your teeth. Though Walt was able to sell films to local businesses, he was unable to find a distributor for his 6-minute cartoons, many of which he had finished at a cost of thousands and thousands of dollars. When it was clear that no distributor was going to pick up his humorous fairy tales, he made one last attempt at creating a commercial cartoon. In 1923, one of the most popular cartoons coming out of New York was Coco the Clown, a mischievous animated character who comes to life while an artist draws him, and then typically wreaks havoc in the artist's office. Walt believed that he might create a successful cartoon series by simply reversing this conceit. Instead of an animated character entering the world of real people, a real girl might enter the world of cartoons. This single cartoon, created as a proof of concept for the full series, was largely animated by Walt himself, as by then most of his staff, owed hundreds of dollars in back wages, had moved on to other jobs. The cartoon, called Alice's Wonderland, was finished, but by this time, Laugh-O-Grams was too far in debt to move forward. His company, Laugh-O-Grams, declared bankruptcy. Creditors seized the company's few assets, leaving Walt nothing aside from experience and understanding that he was not a business manager, and that final cartoon, Alice's Wonderland, that he might offer as a sample of his work. He had started a business, hired a staff, rented office space, and saw it all fall apart by the time he was 21 years old. He still wanted to work in film, but by then understood that Kansas City was far from any place where he might find a distributor. With this bankruptcy, he had also damaged his name in town. In his mind, he saw two options. He could move to New York, which was the center of animation, or he could move to Los Angeles, which was the center of live-action film production. He believed that he had likely missed the start of animation, as there were now a dozen well-established studios in New York. His brother Roy was also out in Los Angeles, still recovering from TB, a disease doctors assumed he had acquired while in the military. It was therefore covered under veterans' benefits. Walt knew to which coast he wanted to travel. For public interviews later in his life, it was this point, the moment he left his beloved Missouri, to which Walt often pointed as the starting point for his future success in animation, the moment where he left home. This moment was also a better beginning for such a story, as it led more directly to those events for which he was most known.
Well, I came to Hollywood and arrived here in August 1923 with $40 in my pocket and a coat and a pair of trousers that didn't match. And one half of my suitcase had my shirts and underwear and things. The other half had my drawing materials. It was a cardboard suitcase at that.
The reason that Walt had so little to pack was, of course, because he had lost so much with laughograms. But in how Walt related the story here, which was from a televised interview, it seems as though he is just starting out, interested in life in pictures, rather than recovering from the failure of his first animation studio.
Well, I tried to get a job doing anything I could in the studio so I could learn. I was a little discouraged with the cartoon at that time. I felt at that time that I was getting into it too late. In other words, I thought the cartoon business was established in such a way that there's no chance to break into it. So I tried to get a job in Hollywood, working in the picture business so I could learn it. I would have liked to have been a director or any part of that.
He went to Universal Studios. He talked to producers. He tried to find work on a live-action crew.
There was nothing open, so before I knew it, I had my drawing board out and I started back at the cartoon. And I was able to secure a contract for 12 of these short films. And I did all the drawing myself. I had no help at all. I was all alone, but I made the first 6 practically alone.
Here, Walt is talking about the Alice's Wonderland cartoon. Shortly after he arrived in California, Alice's Wonderland and subsequent films in the series were picked up and distributed by Margaret Winkler and her fiancé, Charles Mintz. Their company distributed other animated shorts, including the Coco and the Clown series and Felix the Cat. The contract called for a total of 12 Alice shorts to be delivered in 1924, with options to do the same in 1925 and 1926. The contract also stipulated that the original girl from Missouri, Virginia Davis, would star in the series. Virginia's mother, who had long wanted her daughter to find a role in show business, agreed to come to California to continue the series, with her daughter initially receiving $100 a month to stand before the camera with a white tarp behind her and interact with cartoon characters that Walt would later draw. But as important as that contract was, Walt asked his brother Roy to leave a tuberculosis treatment center, as he was now mostly recovered, and become the business manager for what would soon be called the Disney Brothers Cartoon Studio.
My brother was here, and in effect, the government helped subsidize us, and I'll explain that to you. My brother was a veteran of the First World War, and he had been hospitalized and things, and so he was receiving a certain disability compensation. It amounted to about $85 a month, and we lived on that while we established the studio. And from that time on, my brother Roy and I have been together in this business.
Back in Kansas City, Walt had managed a studio somewhat like a social club, a place where his boys hung out and worked on pictures. But now Roy brought business acumen, financial discipline, and a sense of restraint to Walt's creative world. It was exactly what had been missing when Walt had tried to start Laughograms.
He's my big brother. And he's the one that, when I was a little fella, I used to go to with some of my wild ideas, and he'd either straighten me out, put me on the right path or something, or if he didn't agree with me, I'd work on it for years until I got him to agree with me. But I must say that we've had our problems that way. That's been the proper balance that has been needed in our organization. And he watches out for the financial side of it, and the corporate side.
And as money came in from the Alice series, Walt was able to, more or less, rebuild his Laughogram studio out in California with some of the exact same people he had worked with back home.
Then at that time, I was able to get some of the boys that had been with me in Kansas City to come out. So from the 7th on, I had some help, and I got by the first year, and they were fairly successful, and that led to other things. And with some of the boys I'd worked with in Kansas City, augmenting the setup, I was able to eventually build an organization, and it reached a point that I had so many working with me, and there's so much time and attention demanded that I had to drop the drawing end of it myself. But I've never regretted it, because drawing was always a means to an end with me. And so through these other boys who were good draftsmen and artists in many different phases of the business, very talented people, coordinating their talents is what has built this business. And if I hadn't have dropped the drawing end of it myself, I don't think I'd have built this organization.
During the early days of the California studio, the income from each Alice cartoon, which was initially $1,500, barely covered production costs. Even when the price was raised to $1,800, Walt still lived in an apartment. At times, Walt borrowed money from his Uncle Robert and others to meet payroll. Repeatedly, he battled with Charles Mintz, who managed distribution once he was married to Margaret Winkler, over money and control of the series. But gradually, as the Alice comedies found an audience, Walt saw his standard of living improve. He bought a used Roadster touring car made by the Moon Motor Company of Missouri, a convertible, which, outside of camera equipment, was the first substantial purchase he'd ever made for himself. In one photograph, Walt appears full of pride and confidence when standing next to this car. The Alice series ran for 57 films, with 4 different girls playing the lead role. But later cartoons were far more focused on the animated animals than they were on Alice. As the popularity of this series declined, Charles Mintz entered an agreement with Universal Pictures to create a new cartoon character. As Universal felt there were too many cats in cartoons, such as Felix the Cat and Crazy Cat, they asked Mintz to create a series with a different animal. Mintz asked Disney to submit samples. Disney submitted a rabbit character, one that with revisions eventually became Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. The deal for this series was contractually arranged between Universal and Mintz, with animation produced by the Disney studio. By this point, Walt had observed that most cartoons used slapstick gags to engage the audience. It almost didn't matter which character was at the center of a gag, beneath a rock that was falling from the sky or humorously stumbling down the stairs, as it was the gag that was funny, not the character. But Walt believed that he could deepen the effect of comedy if humor came from the personality of Oswald and the other characters rather than just from gags. This was one way that the Disney efforts with animation in California might be different than animation that came out of New York.
Well, no, I'd say human personalities in the body of a cartoon animal. It was just a way to sort of crowd our way into with the competition, you know.
The competition of animated cartoons?
Yes, in those days I had Felix the Cat to compete with, and I can't remember all the others, but you just had to get in there, and you had to make them funnier or better, or I don't know what.
Another way that Walt tried to elevate Disney animation concerned movement. By this point, the world of cinema was on the verge of change. Silent movies were never silent. A theater typically had a pianist, an organist, or a small orchestra that provided a musical accompaniment for the feature on screen. But by this point, multiple companies were working to perfect a process that would allow recorded sound to be perfectly synchronized with screen images. In the mid-1920s, as Walt finished work on the Alice series and started work on the Oswald series, none of these systems were perfected. Multiple companies explored how sound on disc, using equipment that linked a playback unit with a projector, might provide synchronized sound from movies, and other companies explored how optical recordings printed on the far side of a strip of film might provide the same. Walt, like others in the industry, understood that the medium would soon change. Even though all of the Alice comedies and the Oswald cartoons are silent, some sequences, particularly in the 1927 Oswald series, have a rhythm and bounce, a meter to the movement that suggests a visual dance.
I seldom thought of our silent product without some musical complement. I used to talk to the organist in the theater on arrangements before a film was shown. I even had a gadget which ensured a crude kind of synchronization between the organ music and the picture action. In 1925, I had an animated cat in one of our silents direct the orchestra in the pit from the screen. It may seem a curious thing that even in those early films, with their explanatory balloons, I had thought of them in terms of sound and speech and dreamed of the day when the voice would be synchronized with the silent action. But I felt sure it was coming. Our tempo and rhythm and general animation technique were already being adjusted so that sound could fit in readily when it came.
The Oswald cartoons were popular, so popular that in February 1928, only 5 months after the first cartoon premiered, Universal signed a contract with Charles Mintz not just for 1 more year, but for 3. Film Daily reported, "It was to be expected that the contract between Winkler and Universal would be renewed, for the Oswald the Lucky Rabbit cartoons have proved one of the best sellers of the Universal short subject program. Charlie Mintz's organization has been delivering, and how, and Universal is lucky to be assured these popular cartoons for an additional 3 years." Missing from this notice was, of course, Walt, as the Disney studio was essentially working as a subcontractor to make this series for Mintz. But the success of the Oswald series convinced Walt that he should be better paid for them, which led to battles once again between Walt and Mintz over money and control. Shortly after this new contract between Universal and Mintz was signed, Walt, along with Lillian, traveled to New York to negotiate in person with Mintz, specifically to raise the amount the studio received for each finished cartoon. Walt naively believed that if Mintz refused, he could just take Oswald to another distributor. But Walt quickly learned that not only did Mintz own the character, Mintz had prepared for this moment by quietly hiring away most of the animators that worked at Walt's studio. As it turned out, all but 3 of Walt's animators had agreed to work for Mintz if he took over the series. Walt and Lillian's train ride home from New York is one of the most mythologized moments in the history of animation, a moment where Walt looked at the very real possibility that his California studio might go bankrupt, much in the fashion of the one he had started back in Kansas City. In interviews closer to the time of this event, when the sting was still fresh, Walt focused more on the financial ruin that waited for him back home, as his studio was about to lose not only its lead character, but most of its artists. Here is one early version in which Walt talks about that train ride in which he first thinks about a mouse cartoon.
He popped out of my mind onto a drawing pad 20 years ago on a train ride from Manhattan to Hollywood, at a time when the business fortunes of my brother Roy and myself were at lowest ebb and disaster seemed right around the corner.
But in interviews given later in Walt's life, he was less focused on the possible ruin and was able to spin out this as a story in which a few animators in California battled against a well-funded and corrupt New York distributor. As opposed to that bankruptcy in Kansas City, This was the type of struggle that later in life Walt would relate in interviews, the kind of struggle that forced him to rethink his options, the kind of struggle that also led to new success. Part of the problem here was that Walt hadn't fully understood how his contract with Mintz limited his control over his work. Another part of the problem was that Mintz had deeply underestimated how vital Walt's oversight was in creating successful animation, even though Walt himself no longer drew any of the scenes. Here is that much longer, later version when Walt tells this same story.
Well, it came about through a situation that I was contracting with a middleman for my films, and they were being released through Universal. And he was a rather unscrupulous character, and he thought he could cut in and move in a little better, and I pulled away from him, and I was left alone, and he happened to own the character. He had a right to the character. So I had to get a new character, and I'd been doing a rabbit. It was called Oswald the Rabbit. I did and started for him. So I had to have a new character. And I was coming back after this meeting in New York, and Mrs. Disney's with me, and it was on the train in those days, you know, and there's over 3 days from New York. And I said, we got to get a new character, and I'd always, I'd fool around a lot with little mice, and they were always cute characters, and they hadn't been overdone in the picture field. They'd been used but never featured. So I decided it would be with a mouse.
There are many conflicting stories as to how this mouse character ended up with its famous name, but this was the story that Walt, at least later in life, most often told, with Walt and Lillian still on the train.
Oh, and then the name came, what would you call him, and the euphony there of Mickey Mouse, and I had a Mortimer first, and my wife shook her head, and then I tried Mickey, and she nodded the other way, and that was it.
But there was a lesson here that, at least at the time, was far larger than a drawing of a mouse. The lesson was that Walt, moving forward, would always own his own characters and would never again give them away in a contract.
So that was one of the big lessons I learned, and from then on I said there's no middleman. He contributed nothing. We did everything.
But this sequence of events set Walt on a new path. He still had 3 Oswald cartoons to finish under his current contract with Mintz, and while those cartoons were being finished, the artist who had agreed to work with Mintz remained at the Disney studio. With UB Iwerks and 2 other artists, Walt established a production system whereby he secretly developed a cartoon featuring Mickey Mouse. Iwerks worked by himself in a space away from the other animators, so the team that would be with Mintz wouldn't know what Disney was developing. Iwerks also worked on this cartoon at night and at times in Walt's garage. This cartoon, inspired by Charles Lindbergh's record-breaking flight from New York to Paris, presented Mickey building and testing his own plane, largely to impress Minnie Mouse. This effort, a silent film called Plane Crazy, was screened in Los Angeles. It was viewed by distributors, but ultimately, no one was interested in releasing it. Walt then created a second Mickey Mouse cartoon, a silent called The Galloping Gaucho, in the hope that it would find a distributor. This was a playful parody of a Douglas Fairbanks picture called The Gaucho, released the previous year, but it too failed to find distribution. Then Walt had an idea. Inspired by the continued success of The Jazz Singer, the first feature to popularize synchronized sound, Walt sensed that a Mickey Mouse cartoon might gain attention from a distributor if it was created with sound, not just sound effects and background music, but if the cartoon, frame by frame, moved in time with a musical soundtrack, something like an animated Broadway musical or a continuous dance created with drawings.
Well, no, the first Mickey Mouse was made silent, and while we were making the first Mickey Mouse, sound came. So we decided that there's no sense in making anything more silent, and we immediately switched to sound, and we didn't have any sound equipment or anything else.
A sound cartoon would also require a voice for the character. And here is Walt, in the voice of Mickey Mouse, explaining how he came to voice the lead.
Is it true that you did the voice for Mickey yourself in the early days?
Oh, yeah, I still do it.
I was going to ask you if you could, and you still can.
Well, it's just the falsetto, and we were fooling around and trying to get a voice for a mouse, and nobody knew what a mouse would sound like, so I said, well, it's kind of like this. And the guy said, well, why don't you do it? And I knew I'd always be on the payroll, so I did it.
But this type of sound production brought unique challenges. Even after the visual portions of the film were finished and the score had been written, Walt needed to record the music using experimental equipment in New York. Unlike today, when a soundtrack can be built one element at a time, in 1928, all sounds needed to be recorded at once, which included the music, the voice actors, and the sound effects. If any element was off or out of sync, that take needed to be redone entirely.
We used to have to do everything at one time. And we used to have to run the cartoon. We'd have the fellows with the sound effects. We had the people with the voices. We had the orchestra going, and everybody had to synchronize and hit that thing right on the button.
The recording session was overseen by conductor Carl Edward, who had directed the orchestra at the Strand Theater in New York for 13 years, but for the past year had focused on motion picture sound production. The first recording session was held on Saturday, September 15th. To guide Edward, Disney artists had created a film marked with India ink that indicated the tempo the orchestra should follow. This, too, was an experimental approach, something akin to music being added to a live-action dance sequence after that sequence was filmed, a sequence in which the tempo changed and stopped as the production continued. To make matters worse, Walt didn't need just one good take, he needed two. One for theaters that used an optical strip printed on film, and a second for theaters that used a disc system.
For Mickey's first picture, I had planned to go all out on sound, and those plans came very near spelling a major disaster for us. To launch our picture impressively, I had hired a full New York orchestra with a famous director to do the recording. The musicians were to cost $10 an hour. I thought 15 men would be enough, but the director insisted on having 30 men. Because I was awed by him, I was finally persuaded to take the 30. The upshot was that I had to borrow on my automobile, and Roy and I had to mortgage our homes as well to cover the cost of that first synchronization for Steamboat Willie. And when it was finished, the picture wouldn't synchronize with the sound.
Walt is misremembering part of this. Walt did mortgage his house, but he didn't mortgage his car. He asked his brother Roy to sell it. Though a few years earlier, Walt had owned a 1924 Moon Roadster, by 1928 he owned a much newer and more valuable car, a 1926 Roadster. Roy took out a classified ad in the Los Angeles Times that read, Moon 26, $525, new tires, Lovejoy shocks, rumble seat. Looks fine, good condition, 2719 Hyperion. Walt also asked his brother to pursue a bank loan to ensure that Steamboat Willie was finished. At this point, Walt was all in. For the second recording session, Disney created a new system to mark the tempo. A bouncing ball was superimposed over a print of the cartoon, which indicated when Edward and the orchestra should hit each beat.
And we had a way of doing it, though. We had a little kind of a little beat that worked up and down, and there was so many of those beats, and they were all musicians working for me, so they could follow those beats, and when it came to a certain number of beats, they would go ah, or they would go bang, or they would go this, or they would pop one of these pop guns, and they would always fit.
The second recording session was a tremendous expense, but this time, Edward was able to follow the tempo. This time, each line of music, each sound effect came in on time. This time, Walt delivered his lines for Mickey, Minnie, Pete, and even the parrot in perfect synchronization with the movement on screen. With a satisfactory print, Walt then met with executives at Universal, the home studio for Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, and even though executives were interested in the film, they ultimately didn't offer Walt a contract. However, the manager of the Colony Theater, a theater that was attached to Universal, was interested in Steamboat Willie. The Colony was a movie palace with nearly 2,000 seats, a showplace for films and vaudeville. Walt was initially offered $500 to let the Colony show the film for 2 weeks. Walt, perhaps sensing that luck was finally on his side, asked for $1,000 and got it.
His first actual screen appearance was at the Old Colony Theater in New York in Steamboat Willie, with its sound effects and cautious speech.
Steamboat Willie premiered on November 18, 1928, and the following day, the cartoon was reviewed in the New York Times. On the same program is the first sound cartoon produced by Walter Disney, creator of The Oswald the Rabbit. The current film is called Steamboat Willie, and it introduces a new cartoon character henceforth to be known as Mickey Mouse. It is an ingenious piece of work with a good deal of fun. It growls, whines, squawks, and makes other various sounds that add to its mirthful quality. From there, interest in this cartoon and in Mickey Mouse, and in the unique way that music was layered into the movement of Disney animation, grew. In this Disney cartoon, music wasn't an afterthought. It was one of the central reasons that this cartoon existed in the first place, as the characters, the steamboat, and even its whistle reacted to every beat, each musical phrase. And the audience in that lovely darkness was captivated. Or, as Walt said about the appearance of Mickey at the Colony Theater,
he brought in the money which saved the day. He paved the way for our more elaborate screen ventures.
And with that, the Disney studio now had the finances to grow in new directions. So hopefully we've done good here today. On our podcast, we put a little bit more Walt into the 100 Years of Wonder. The audio about Walt's early years today came from interviews he gave for radio and TV in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. In this, I'm sure you can hear the difference in Walt's personality and public identity as he moved through those decades. But maybe we can also explore that a little more on some future show. I'll be back next week with a new episode, which I think will be focused on a unique element of Disney film in the 1940s. As you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just two things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions. You can support our efforts by becoming a monthly Bandcamp subscriber. On Bandcamp, you'll find over 200 episodes not available on iTunes. But the best reason to join is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can become a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in the show notes. Until then, this is Todd James Pierce.